The Missouri courthouse had seen its share of tense mornings, but this one had a strange kind of electricity in the air, an almost imperceptible shift, like the pause before a thunderstorm. The marble floors gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights, and every footstep echoed a little too loudly in the hallway. In courtroom 2, where the case of State v. Daniel Rourke was about to resume, the air felt heavier than it should for a Wednesday morning. At the far corner of the room, away from the crowded rows of wooden benches, sat Canine Officer Duke. He wasn't just any dog. He was a 5-year-old German shepherd with the posture of a soldier and the eyes of a detective who'd already guessed the ending of the story. His coat, black and tan with the sheen that caught the light, was immaculate. His ears stood tall, swiveling slightly at the softest sounds, and his tail rested on the floor in a perfect line. Most people in the room didn't quite know why he was there. A few whispered assumptions passed among the spectators. Mascot for the police, someone murmured. Public relations, another guessed. In truth, Duke's official purpose this morning was vague, even to some of the court staff. He wasn't scheduled to take part in the proceedings in any formal way. He was simply listed as K9 Presence. But his handler, Officer Jenna Hart, knew Duke wasn't the kind of presence you could ignore. She sat beside him, her uniform crisp, her posture matching his. Jenna had been partnered with Duke for nearly 4 years, and she could read him as easily as an open book. She didn't need him to bark or growl to know when something wasn't right. His breathing would change, or his gaze would fix just a little too long on someone. On the other side of the room, at the defense table, sat Daniel Rourke. He was thin to the point of gaunt, his pale skin contrasting sharply with the dark suit he'd clearly worn before, probably many times. He shuffled papers unnecessarily, avoiding eye contact with most people. But every so often, his gaze flickered toward the corner where Duke sat. It wasn't curiosity, not exactly. It was sharper, quicker, like someone checking to see if a shadow was still following them. Jenna noticed it immediately. Duke noticed it too. The trial itself was already a precarious affair. Rourke was accused of being part of a drug trafficking ring that had moved large quantities of narcotics through the Midwest. The initial bust had been big, several storage units raided, vehicles seized, but the case had since begun to unravel. A key eyewitness had disappeared. The chain of evidence for some of the seized items was under question, and the jury had been listening to days of testimony that often felt more like guesswork than fact. The prosecution's hope rested on connecting Rourke directly to the drugs found in a rural warehouse on the outskirts of town. But without someone who could place him there, it was all circumstantial. The defense was exploiting that weakness, masterfully painting the entire investigation as sloppy, even desperate. In the front row of the gallery, a few reporters from local outlets had their notebooks ready, though none expected much action today. If anything, this was supposed to be one of the more procedural sessions. Motions, objections, and long-winded expert testimony. But to Jenna, something felt off. It wasn't the case itself. She'd been to dozens of trials like this. It was Rourke. Specifically, the way he looked at Duke. When Duke caught Rourke's gaze for the first time, his posture shifted almost imperceptibly, weight forward, neck slightly extended. He didn't growl, didn't make a sound, but his focus narrowed, like a camera lens zooming in. It was the kind of alert Jenna had seen in training, the one that said, "I recognize something here." Jenna kept her eyes forward, pretending not to notice, but inside, her instincts were already waking up. Dogs didn't stare at people like that without reason, especially not Duke. He wasn't the type to get distracted by random human behavior. He had been trained to read body language, detect scents, and respond to specific trigger cues. If he was reacting, it meant something. The judge entered, and everyone rose. The room settled into the slow rhythm of legal proceedings. Questions, objections, sustains, and overrules. But Jenna's mind wasn't on the law. It was on the strange connection forming, silent and invisible, between the defendant and the K-9 officer at her side. An hour into the morning session, during a particularly dull stretch of cross-examination, Duke's ears twitched again. Rourke had glanced over his shoulder this time, quickly, like a man checking a rear-view mirror. When his eyes landed on Duke, he froze for half a beat, then looked away. It was quick enough that most people wouldn't have noticed. But Jenna wasn't most people, and Duke definitely wasn't most dogs. By the time the judge called for the morning recess, Jenna's curiosity was bordering on suspicion. She rose, giving Duke a subtle hand signal. They moved together toward the hallway, the shuffle of jurors and lawyers filling the air. She didn't know it yet, but in less than 10 minutes, something would happen in that hallway that would change the entire direction of the trial. And it would start with just 2 words. The courthouse hallway smelled faintly of old paper and floor polish, the kind of scent that clung to government buildings, no matter how much fresh air you pumped through them. During the recess, people moved in clusters, jurors escorted by the bailiff, attorneys whispering in tight circles, reporters hunched over their phones, trying to draft quick updates before court resumed. Officer Jenna Hart stayed near the end of the hall with Duke, letting the K-9 sit close to the wall so passers-by wouldn't feel cornered. Duke didn't seem interested in anyone but the defendant, and that, more than anything, kept Jenna on alert. The trial had already been a delicate balancing act for the prosecution. Assistant District Attorney Paul Kessler, a man with a reputation for methodical precision, had come into the case knowing it wasn't perfect. The initial arrest of Daniel Rourke had been the product of a large-scale narcotics operation spanning several counties. The bust had yielded drugs, cash, and enough paraphernalia to choke the evidence room. But the problem wasn't what they had found, it was proving who it belonged to. The state's star witness, a low-level associate who'd been willing to trade testimony for leniency, had vanished 2 weeks before trial. The police suspected witness intimidation, but without proof, it was just another hole in the case. Surveillance footage from the warehouse had caught a man of Rourke's build moving crates, but the grainy image could be anyone. A vehicle linked to him had been found near the warehouse, but no one could say he was driving it that night. The defense had hammered away at these gaps like a carpenter with an endless supply of nails. Rourke's attorney, Sandra Mullins, thrived on dismantling cases just like this, cases that looked strong in the headlines, but wobbled under the weight of courtroom scrutiny. She had a knack for turning probably into possibly, and possibly into reasonable doubt. Jenna had been called to court primarily as a symbolic presence. The K-9 unit had been involved in parts of the investigation, and Duke's name appeared in some of the reports, but he hadn't been a decisive factor in the warehouse search. In truth, Jenna had expected this to be a routine court appearance show. Up, sit quietly, maybe confirm a chain of custody detail, then leave. But now, she wasn't so sure. The defense didn't hide their disdain for Duke's presence. Earlier that morning, Mullins had rolled her eyes slightly when Kessler introduced Jenna and Duke to the jury as part of the investigative team. One of the jurors had even whispered, "Why is the dog here? He's not going to testify." That whisper had carried just far enough for Jenna to hear, and it stuck with her. She knew they were right in a literal sense Duke couldn't take the stand. He couldn't swear an oath or explain his reactions, but he could respond in ways that made people notice. And Duke was responding now. Every time Rourke passed within a certain distance, Duke's demeanor shifted. His breathing slowed, his ears angled forward, and his gaze sharpened. Jenna had learned to read that body language as clearly as words. "I know something about this person," As the hallway cleared for a moment, Jenna found herself alone with Duke near the vending machines. The jury was being escorted back into their holding room, and the attorneys had retreated into a side office. That's when Rourke emerged from the men's room at the far end of the hall. He walked with the same careful pace he'd had all morning, but his eyes flicked toward Duke almost immediately. Jenna's pulse quickened. She kept her posture casual, one hand resting lightly on Duke's harness. Rourke passed close enough for her to hear the faint shuffle of his shoes on the tile. He glanced at her, then at Duke, and his lips moved. At first, she thought he'd said nothing, just a nervous mouth twitch. But Duke's reaction was instantaneous. The shepherd's ears shot up, his tail stiffened, and he leaned forward slightly, every muscle poised for action. His eyes locked on Rourke with an intensity that could have bored holes through steel. Jenna's mind grabbed at the sound, replaying it in real time. 2 words. She was certain she'd heard them right, though they had been barely above a whisper. She didn't react outwardly, not yet. Instead, she gave Duke a subtle signal to hold his position, keeping her own face as neutral as possible. The last thing she wanted was to alert Rourke that she'd caught it. Rourke didn't break stride. He kept moving toward the courtroom door, disappearing inside as if nothing had happened. But Jenna knew better. Duke didn't false alert. Not like that. And the words she'd heard, if she was right, were something no one outside the K-9 unit should know. Her heart was still thudding when Paul Kessler appeared from the conference room. "You good?" he asked, glancing at Duke. "Fine," she said automatically. Then she hesitated. "Actually, maybe better than fine." Kessler gave her a curious look, but the bailiff was already calling people back to their seats. As Jenna walked back into the courtroom, Duke at her side, she kept running the moment over in her mind. 2 words. That's all it had been. But in her experience, sometimes 2 words could unravel an entire defense. She didn't know yet how she was going to bring it up, or if she even could, but she was certain of one thing. Daniel Rourke had just made a mistake, and Duke had heard it. The hallway outside courtroom 2 was quieter now, but that silence was heavy thick with the unspoken thoughts of jurors in their holding room, the whispered strategies of lawyers inside offices, and the steady hum of the vending machines. Against the wall, Officer Jenna Hart stood beside Duke, her back to the wall, arms folded casually but not idly. Duke sat at her left, poised in that perfect at-ease position that wasn't really at ease at all. His ears swiveled slightly, always tracking sounds, his dark eyes scanning anyone who came near. The recess was almost over. The bailiff would be calling everyone back in within minutes. Jenna was thinking about how to bring up what she'd heard those 2 words, without looking like she was inventing a story. But part of her didn't need to say anything yet. She wanted to watch Rourke again. She wanted to see if it had been a fluke, or if Duke would react the same way a second time. Rourke was still inside the courtroom, talking quietly with his attorney Sandra Mullins. He glanced up once, saw Jenna in the hallway, then quickly looked back at his papers. It was the kind of glance people gave when they didn't want you to know they were watching you. Jenna pretended to scroll through her phone, but she was watching in her periphery. She saw Mullins gather up her notes, Rourke adjust his tie, and then they stepped into the hallway together. The moment he passed Duke, the air seemed to change. It wasn't traumatic, no barking, no lunging. But Duke's body language was as unmistakable to Jenna as a shout would have been to anyone else. His head lifted, his chest expanded with a deeper inhale, and his ears pivoted forward like radar dishes locking onto a signal. His pupils narrowed slightly, a subtle but telling sign. And there it was again. Rourke's lips moved. Jenna heard it this time more clearly. Not a mutter, Not an accidental sound. Actual words. Find stash. 2 words. Barely audible, spoken in a flat tone. Jenna's breath caught, but she didn't move. Duke, however, reacted instantly. His muscles tightened, his gaze fixed hard on Rourke, and his tail straightened like a flagpole. To the casual observer, it might have looked like the dog was simply paying attention. But Jenna knew better. That was his alert posture. He had been trained on a series of verbal cues, each associated with specific tasks during searches. Find stash was one of them, used by handlers when directing a K9 to locate hidden narcotics. Duke didn't just know the phrase. It was burned into his working memory, reinforced by years of training and repetition. And Rourke had just said it. Jenna's mind raced. Civilians didn't know these commands. They weren't public knowledge, weren't written in the reports, and certainly weren't something a defendant should be tossing around casually. Unless he had prior experience hearing it during police operations, or unless he had been directly involved with the very narcotics Duke was trained to find. The words could have been an attempt to rattle Duke, to test him, or maybe just a nervous slip from someone too comfortable with criminal jargon. Whatever. The reason, it wasn't normal. She kept her face neutral, her voice calm when she said, "Easy, boy." It was both a command to Duke and a warning to herself. She couldn't tip her hand here. Not in the hallway, not with the defense attorney only a step away. Mullins didn't seem to notice anything unusual. She was already walking ahead toward the conference room, flipping through her notes. Rourke trailed behind her, glancing over his shoulder just once, just long enough to meet Duke's eyes again. This time, Jenna saw it clearly. Rourke was uneasy. Duke held his gaze until the defendant disappeared into the conference room. Then the dog looked up at Jenna, as if to say, "Did you catch that?" "Oh, I caught it," she murmured under her breath. The bailiff's voice carried down the hall. "All rise for the court." The moment was over. People began shuffling back toward the courtroom doors. As they walked in, Jenna's mind was spinning. What she had just witnessed wouldn't count as evidence. A defense attorney would shred it in seconds, claim it was a coincidence, a misunderstanding, or even that Duke was reacting to Jenna's own body language. But there was no denying what she had heard, and more importantly, what Duke had responded to. She took her seat with Duke beside her, forcing herself to focus on the testimony that resumed. But her attention kept drifting back to those 2 words, echoing in her mind like a ticking clock. Find stash. Jenna knew she couldn't bring it up without proof. But maybe, just maybe, she could create a situation in which proof presented itself. It would be risky. It might even be career-ending if it looked like she was staging something in court. But if it worked, it could crack Rourke's defense wide open. And Duke, sitting at her side, seemed ready for whatever came next. Jenna barely heard the next witness take the stand. The steady rhythm of the prosecutor's questions and the defense's objections became background noise, like the hum of an air conditioner. Her mind was still in the hallway, replaying the sound of Rourke's voice and Duke's unmistakable reaction. 2 words, find stash. The phrase wasn't just familiar, it was part of Duke's core vocabulary, a cue drilled into him during hundreds of hours of training. In the K9 unit, it was one of the high-value commands reserved for live searches. When spoken, it told Duke to activate his full search mode for concealed narcotics. And the way Rourke had said it, it hadn't been playful or curious. It was almost mechanical, delivered like someone speaking a password they already knew. She shifted in her seat, trying to push down the surge of adrenaline. On one hand, this was huge. On the other, it was dangerous. If she went to the prosecutor right now and repeated what she'd heard, it would be her word against Rourke's. The defense would argue she misheard. They'd claim Duke was reacting to her body tension, or to the simple fact that Rourke was the focus of the case. They could even suggest that she, as a canine handler invested in the outcome, was reading too much into an innocent moment. But Jenna had learned a long time ago that there were two ways to deal with moments like this: file them away and move on, or find a way to turn them into undeniable proof. Duke shifted beside her, laying his chin briefly on her boot before returning to his upright posture. It was a subtle reassurance, the way he sometimes reminded her that he was ready to work if she needed him. Her thoughts drifted to the first time she'd trained him on that specific command. It had been in the old storage facility the department used for exercises. The phrase "find stash" was always paired with a strong reward. Once Duke located the hidden narcotics, he'd get his favorite tug toy. The pairing of command and success was so strong that even in a crowded, noisy environment, Duke could hear it and immediately lock into work mode. And that was exactly what had happened in the hallway. Her eyes flicked toward the defense table. Rourke sat stiffly beside Mullins, flipping a pen between his fingers. He didn't look in her direction now, but she could see the tautness in his jaw. Every so often, his fingers drummed on the tabletop, an unconscious beat that didn't match the rhythm of the testimony. She began thinking through scenarios. Could she somehow repeat the moment in a way the jury could witness? What if the prosecutor asked her about Duke's training in court? Could she slip the phrase into a demonstration without it looking orchestrated? Risky. Incredibly risky. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was their opening. The case was built on fragile circumstantial evidence. The missing witness had left a crater in the prosecution's strategy. The jury was restless. She could see it in their faces. They needed something vivid, something that would burn itself into their memory. And few things stuck with a jury more than a dog reacting in a way they couldn't ignore. The trick was doing it without violating procedure. If she made it look like a stunt, it could backfire and actually help the defense. But if it appeared to be a spontaneous part of explaining Duke's capabilities, that was another story. The more she thought about it, the more it felt possible. The key would be getting Paul Kessler on board. He was cautious by nature, the kind of prosecutor who preferred clean, airtight evidence to anything remotely theatrical. But desperate times had a way of loosening even the most careful grip on protocol. And this trial was nearing that point. Jenna glanced at the clock. Above the judge's bench, they had another hour before the lunch recess. She decided she wouldn't say anything until then. The last thing she wanted was to draw attention mid-session. Her attention snapped back when the witness on the stand mentioned the K-9 unit. It was a fleeting reference, just noting that a search team had been deployed during the warehouse raid. But the mention sent a ripple of interest through a couple of jurors. Jenna made a mental note. If Duke was going to have his moment in court, it needed to be tied to something relevant, something the jury could connect to the events in question. She thought again about the hallway exchange. The timing of Rourke's words had been odd right. As he passed Duke, just before heading into the conference room, it was almost like he was testing the dog, or maybe taunting him. Either way, it wasn't normal behavior for a defendant. Duke gave a small huff of breath beside her, drawing her attention. He was still watching Rourke. Not obsessively, but with the quiet, steady vigilance of someone keeping tabs on a person of interest. Lunch break finally came. The judge dismissed the jury. The attorneys began gathering their notes, and the murmur of conversation filled the courtroom. Jenna waited until the flow of people thinned, then made her way toward Kessler. He was tucking a legal pad into his briefcase when she leaned in. "We need to talk," she said quietly. He looked up, frowning slightly. "About what?" "Duke just reacted to a verbal command from Rourke," she said, keeping her voice low. "Not just any command one of our drug search cues. I heard him say it. Twice." Kessler's brow furrowed. "You're sure?" 100%. He exhaled slowly, eyes scanning the room as if weighing the angles. That's interesting, he admitted. But we can't exactly put Duke on the stand. I know, Jenna said. But we can show the jury what happens when someone says it. If we make it part of explaining his training, it won't look staged? Kessler hesitated. He didn't. Like Gamble's, and she could see him running through the potential objections in his head. But she also saw the moment he realized they didn't have many cards left to play. All right, he said finally. If we do this, it has to be airtight. No grandstanding. And you'll follow my lead exactly. Jenna nodded, understood. As they left the courtroom for the lunch recess, Duke trotting silently at her, sighed. She felt the weight of what they were about to attempt. This was more than just a demonstration. It was a test not only of Duke's training, but of whether two quiet words in a hallway could shift the balance of an entire trial. Deep down, she knew, Duke was ready. The courtroom was tense that morning. The defense attorney had been gaining ground, twisting witness statements and poking holes in the prosecution's timeline. Detective Harris sat at the prosecution table, eyes on the jury, silently hoping for something to tip the scales. Max, the police dog, sat calmly near the witness stand with his handler, Officer Perez. Most in the room saw him as a comforting mascot, nothing more. But Harris knew different. 2 nights earlier, in a late-night strategy session, Perez had told Harris about a detail he'd never mentioned in court, a specific word Max reacted to during the investigation. That reaction had led them straight to the suspect's hidden evidence. It was a long shot, but Harris believed it might sway the jury if they could demonstrate it. Judge Carter called the next witness. To everyone's surprise, the prosecution requested Officer Perez and Max. Murmurs filled the courtroom. No one could remember the last time a dog had been brought to the stand as part of live testimony. The defense immediately objected, calling it theatrics, but Carter overruled. If it's relevant, I'll allow it. But this better not be a circus, she warned. Perez took the stand with Max at his side. The Golden Shepherd sat alert, eyes darting between Perez and the jurors. Harris began. Officer Perez, tell the court what happened when you visited the suspect's storage unit. Perez explained how Max sniffed the air, circled twice, then froze by a locked trunk. I gave him the search cue, but nothing happened. Then I said a word I didn't expect him to recognize, and his reaction was immediate. The prosecutor leaned in. What word was that? Perez took a breath. The word was locket. A ripple went through the gallery. Harris continued. And what did Max do? He became agitated, Perez said. He scratched at the trunk so hard I had to pull him back. Inside, we found the missing necklace from the victim, the one tied to the suspect's alibi. The defense tried to object again, claiming hearsay, but Carter motioned for silence. Let the jury hear the rest, she said. Harris asked if they could demonstrate. The judge, skeptical but curious, allowed it. Perez reached into his pocket and pulled out a harmless scent sample, one from the evidence bag containing the, locket. The courtroom went still. Perez crouched, speaking softly to Max. Then, clearly, he said, locket. Max's entire body tensed. He shot to his feet, ears forward, nose twitching violently. He barked once, sharp, commanding, and moved toward the table where the sample rested. The reaction was undeniable. Even the most stoic jurors shifted in their seats. Officer Perez, Harris said, is this the same reaction he had the night you found the evidence? Yes, Perez replied. Exactly the same. The demonstration wasn't just about the dog's skills. It humanized the investigation, making it feel real and unshakable. Jurors saw, with their own eyes, a chain of events too precise to be coincidence. The defense tried to diminish the moment, suggesting Max could have been reacting to Perez's tone or body language. But Harris was ready. They ran the same cue. With a different word, nothing. They tried treat. Max perked up, but stayed seated. Then lock it again. Instant alertness. The judge leaned back, her face unreadable, but there was a spark of intrigue in her eyes. Harris knew. They had shifted the energy in the room. The jury wasn't just hearing about the case anymore. They were experiencing it. When Perez stepped down, Harris saw jurors exchange glances, the kind that silently said, "That was something." The defense's next witness faltered under questioning, and the earlier confidence in their table seemed to wane. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed, shouting about the dog who testified. Perez kept quiet, but Harris knew they'd just changed the trajectory of the trial. Still, there was one more thing Harris hadn't revealed. The second word Max had reacted to during the investigation. That, Harris decided, would be saved for the perfect moment. The trial wasn't over, and neither were the surprises. The courtroom was silent, except for the faint hum of the air conditioning. Every seat was taken. Reporters sat shoulder to shoulder, notebooks open, cameras ready for the recess break. This was not just any trial. This was the case that had gripped the nation. And now, the next witness was not a person, but a dog. K-9 Justice stood patiently near Officer Daniels, a sleek black German shepherd, whose reputation in the force was almost legendary. His calm eyes scanned the room, but his ears twitched slightly, sensing the tension. Officer Daniels kept a steady hand on his leash, while the defense attorney smirked, confident this whole display would collapse into nothing more than courtroom theatrics. Judge Morrison adjusted his glasses. "Officer Daniels, you've indicated the dog can identify the suspect through a specific verbal cue?" "Yes, Your Honor," Daniels replied. Justice responds to certain commands related to scent memory. During the investigation, he associated a particular verbal phrase with the suspect's presence. The defense attorney jumped in. "Your Honor, with all due respect, we are talking about an animal. This is hardly admissible testimony. Animals can't be cross-examined." The judge leaned forward. "Perhaps not in the conventional sense, but expert testimony on the dog's training and behavior may be allowed. I will permit a demonstration." The gallery shifted in their seats, a ripple of anticipation moving through the crowd. Prosecutor Elaine Price rose to her feet. She was tall, with an unshakable poise that made jurors hang on her every word. "Officer Daniels," she said, "can you explain how this cue works?" Daniels nodded. Justice was present during an encounter between the suspect and myself. There were 2 words spoken repeatedly by the suspect during the confrontation. The dog has been trained to respond to those words when detecting the suspect's scent. The prosecutor's eyes locked on the jury. And today, we will see if justice can connect those words to the defendant without any physical contact. The defense objected again, claiming it was trial by circus, but the judge's gavel came down hard. Overruled, proceed. Daniels took a small step forward with justice. The dog's tail swished once alert, but calm. Elaine retrieved a cloth bag from the evidence table, sealed tightly, containing scent samples collected from various sources during the investigation. Each sample was coded and sealed to prevent tampering. "We have 6 sealed scent samples here," Elaine announced. "Only one contains an article handled by the defendant. The others belong to unrelated individuals. The dog will not see them being arranged." The bailiff took the bag, walked behind a privacy screen, and placed the samples in a random order across the far end of the courtroom. No one spoke. You could almost hear the beating of hearts in the room. Then Elaine turned to Daniels. "Officer, give the cue." Daniels took a breath, then clearly said the 2 words, "Check him." Justice's ears shot up instantly. The calm dog transformed into an alert, working professional, his eyes narrowing on the task. Daniels released the short command again, and Justice began moving down the row of scent containers. The jurors leaned forward, mesmerized. Justice sniffed the first sample, nothing. The second, still nothing. The third, he paused slightly, and moved on. It wasn't until he reached the fifth container that his entire posture shifted. He froze, then sat down abruptly, looking up at Daniels with intense focus. Daniels nodded. That's the alert. Signal. This is the one. The bailiff retrieved the fifth container and read the code aloud. It matched the defendant's scent sample. A gasp moved through the courtroom. The defendant's jaw tightened, but his attorney forced a strain. Smile. Ladies and gentlemen, the defense began. Dogs can be mistaken. They can be influenced. Elaine stepped forward smoothly. Justice was not cued to the correct sample in advance. The order was randomized by court staff. He responded only to scent recognition paired with those two words. The judge allowed Daniels to explain the canine's record over 70. Successful identifications in the field, all verified by physical evidence. No false positives. No contamination in this case. Still, the defense wasn't giving up. Your Honor, I request permission to cross-examine the officer and test the so-called reliability right now, in front of the jury. The judge granted it. The defense attorney retrieved a fresh set of samples, again randomized, but this time with the defendant's scent hidden in a different container. Daniels gave the same command. Justice worked through them methodically. First, second, third, and again, sat down in front of the container with the defendant's scent. It was undeniable. The jurors exchanged glances, some even whispering. This was no coincidence. When Justice calmly returned to Daniel's side, the moment carried more weight than any dramatic witness testimony could. Here was an incorruptible witness, one who could not be bribed, threatened, or manipulated. As the jury watched the dog rest quietly at Daniel's feet, Elaine knew the tide had turned. The defense had scoffed at the idea of a dog as a key witness, but now the image of that German shepherd sitting in front of the defendants. Scent sample was burned into their minds. 2 words had triggered it. 2 words had bridged the gap between scent memory and undeniable courtroom evidence. And in that moment, the case felt closer to closing than it had in months. The judge recessed for the day, but the murmurs in the gallery didn't fade. Justice had spoken without ever saying a word. The courtroom was unusually tense the morning of the second week's proceedings. Reporters were already whispering in the hallways that today might bring something explosive. Sarah arrived early, clutching her leather-bound case file, and exchanged a brief nod with Detective Ross. A police dog, Max, sat obediently beside him, though his ears twitched at every sound as if anticipating another command. The defense had been gaining ground, picking apart witness testimonies and poking holes in the timeline. But Sarah had been working on something new, a risky strategy that could either cement the prosecution's case or shatter it entirely. As Judge Bennett entered, everyone rose. The gavel tapped, echoing sharply in the room. Sarah stood, her voice steady, but her hands hidden behind the podium, so no one could see how tightly she was gripping her pen. Your Honor, she began, I would like to recall Officer Max to the stand. The courtroom rippled with quiet laughter, but Judge Bennett raised an eyebrow. Counselor, you know dogs cannot testify. Yes, Your Honor, Sarah replied calmly, but they can demonstrate. Detective Ross led Max forward, the dog moving with disciplined grace. Sarah walked to the center, holding up a small sealed evidence bag containing a leather wallet, the one found at the scene. She knew the jury had already seen this piece, but what they hadn't seen was how Max reacted to it. She crouched, looking into Max's eyes. Max, she said gently, find him. Max sniffed the wallet, his body stiffening before his head jerked toward the defendant's table. A low growl rumbled in his chest. The room went still. Sarah turned to the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, you've heard how Max was trained. To respond only when he detects a scent connected to a crime. You saw this same reaction during the arrest. This isn't coincidence. This is confirmation." The defense attorney jumped up. "Objection. This is prejudicial and unreliable." "Overruled," Judge Bennett said, surprising everyone. "The jury will determine how much weight to give this demonstration." Sarah's heart raced. She pressed forward, clicking a remote to display a video on the court screen. It showed body cam footage from the night of the arrest. Max pulling sharply toward an alley, barking until officers found the discarded knife, later tied to the suspect. Sarah paused the video. This isn't just a dog's instinct. This is a trained, certified law enforcement officer recognizing the same scent twice, once at the crime scene, and again today. The jury leaned forward, the tension in the room practically humming. When the court recessed for lunch, Sarah barely touched her food. She knew the defense would try to undermine Max's credibility in cross-examination. Sure enough, when proceedings resumed, the defense attorney pounced, questioning Ross about scent contamination, handler bias, and training inconsistencies. Ross held firm. "Max has a 98% accuracy rate over 4 years of active duty. That's documented in our department's records." By the time court adjourned, Sarah felt the shift in the atmosphere. The jurors' expressions had changed. They weren't just listening anymore. They were invested. But she also knew they weren't finished. She had one final card to play in the coming days, one that didn't just involve Max, but the two words that had started everything. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed her, shouting questions. She didn't answer. Instead, she glanced at Max, who wagged his tail as if sensing victory was closer than ever. Yet Sarah understood the truth. One wrong move could undo it. All. Tomorrow's testimony could make or break the entire case. And somewhere in the crowd, someone was watching them, someone who didn't want the truth to come out. The final day of the trial dawned gray and heavy, the kind of morning that felt like it was holding its breath. Sarah arrived at the courthouse before sunrise, reviewing her closing arguments one last time in the dim light of her office. She knew the jury was leaning in her favor, but the defense had planted enough seeds of doubt to make victory far from certain. Detective Ross waited outside the courtroom, Max sitting at his side. The dog's alert gaze followed Sarah as she approached. She knelt, resting a hand on his neck. "Today's the day, buddy," she whispered. When court convened, the defense tried to strike first, calling a surprise witness, an independent scent detection expert. The man claimed dogs could be influenced by subtle cues from handlers, that scent trails degraded too quickly to be reliable. Sarah let him talk, knowing it was a setup for her final move. Once the defense rested, she rose, her heart pounding but her expression calm. "Your Honor, the prosecution would like to recall Detective Ross and Officer Max 1. Last time," Judge Bennett sighed but allowed it. The jurors straightened, clearly curious. Ross led Max to the witness area. Sarah stepped closer, holding a small, covered evidence tray. "Detective, please confirm. You have not seen the contents of this tray before today?" "Confirmed." She placed the tray on the floor and lifted the cover. Inside was the very same black hoodie recovered from the alley, sealed in a separate, uncontaminated evidence bag since the night of the murder. Max immediately sniffed, his body stiffening. But Sarah didn't give him the usual command. Instead, she crouched and spoke the same two words the little girl had whispered the night everything changed. "Find truth." The reaction was instant and electric. Max barked sharply, pulling toward the defendant's table, straining against his lead. His growl deepened, his body language unmistakable. Gasps rippled through the gallery. Sarah stood. Members of all. The jury, you've now seen Max react on 3 separate occasions to the wallet, to the knife, and now to the hoodie, without prompting and in a controlled setting. These are not guesses. These are the same trained responses that led to the recovery of key evidence in this case. The defense attorney tried to object, but the damage was done. Every juror's eyes were locked on the defendant, who sat rigid, jaw clenched, hands gripping the table. Sarah clicked the final video onto the screen, the original security footage from the street corner. Grainy though it was, it showed a shadowy figure dropping the hoodie and running. Side by side, she displayed the time-stamped police bodycam footage of Max finding the hoodie minutes later. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, her voice firm but quiet, "this case began with a tragedy. It moved forward because of one child's courage to speak, and because of a trained officer who cannot lie. Max doesn't know the law. He doesn't know court procedure. He knows only what his nose tells him, and it has led us, again and again, to the truth." Her closing argument tied every thread together, the timeline, the physical evidence, the consistent reactions. She reminded them that reasonable doubt did not mean ignoring overwhelming, corroborated proof. When she finished, the courtroom was silent. Even Judge Bennett seemed to pause a beat longer before calling the recess. The jury deliberated for just under 3 hours. When they returned, the foreperson's voice was steady. "We find the defendant guilty on all counts." A rush of sound filled the room, reporters scribbling notes, the victim's family crying quietly, the defendant shouting protests as deputies restrained him. Sarah exhaled, a wave of exhaustion and relief washing over her. She shook Ross's hand, then knelt to scratch Max behind the ears. "You did it, partner." As she gathered her files, the little girl who had first whispered to Max months ago appeared in the gallery, holding her mother's hand. She smiled shyly. "Told you he listens," she said. Sarah knelt, meeting her eyes. "You're braver than you know." Outside, cameras flashed, microphones thrust forward. Sarah made a brief statement thanking the jury, the police, and one 4-legged officer in particular. But the real victory wasn't in the headlines. It was in knowing that the truth had been found and justice had been served, because one little girl had believed a dog would understand her. Max sat at Sarah's side as they walked down the courthouse steps, his tail swaying slowly. Somewhere in the crowd, Sarah spotted the same shadowy figure she'd noticed days ago. But when she looked again, they were gone. The case was over for now. But Sarah knew this city, and she knew the kind of darkness that lingered in its corners. She also knew that as long as she had Max, the next time someone tried to bury the truth, they'd have to get past both of them. And that, she thought, with a faint smile, was never going to happen.